Hi, I'm Denis, and I would like to thank the organizers of the conference for having me. I would like to thank you for clicking on this video, and of course, I would like to thank my commentators for taking the time to read my paper and to comment on it. Today I would like to give you a little introduction to my paper, Guidance of Visual Attention, Animal Origins of Human Agency. In the paper, I try to address what Harry Frankfurt, in an early paper called The Problem of Action, identifies as the deepest challenge in action theory. In particular, I would like to try and explain the distinction between processes that an individual guides and processes that occur without an individual's guidance. Here's an example. Suppose a monkey, a macaque, searches some bushes for raspberries. He actively guides his visual attention shifts from one location to the next until he finds the berries. In contrast with this way of shifting attention, suppose that a bright object abruptly appears in the periphery of the monkey's field of view. In this case, the object captures the macaque's attention, and then his attention shifts passively. Now, I would like to take a step toward addressing the challenge of explaining in what exactly this distinction consists in. My presentation will have three parts. In the first part, I will very briefly motivate my project by commenting on recent action theory. Then in the second section, I want to sketch the argument that I give in the paper for an empirical explication of the notion of the guidance of visual attention. And then finally, in the third and last section, I want to develop a conjecture about the constitution of agency. So let me start by saying something about what motivates my project. I think that recent action theory hasn't done a very great job addressing two very plausible constraints on any account of agency. Constraints, by the way, that we already find in Frankfurt's early paper. The first of these two constraints is what I call the comprehensiveness constraint, which says that an account of agency should try to explain all instances of agency, that is, across kinds of agents and species, and in particular shouldn't just focus narrowly on the case of human agency. Now, the most prominent recent theories of action tended to explain action in terms of propositional intentions, reflection, or individuals' answerability for certain episodes. So they have very little promise to account for all animal action. Think of ants or sharks. They probably don't reflect on their own minds, they're not answerable for what they're doing, and it's at the very least an empirically open question whether they have propositional intentions, that is, thought, the way we have. A more promising recent account tries to explain action in terms of more primitive capacities, and in particular in terms of perception-like goal-representing states that cause an act. These are more promising theories because more animals have perception-like capacities, more animals have perception-like representational capacities, then there are animals that have reflection or propositional thought. But these kinds of theories run into a different difficulty. And this difficulty consists in meeting what I call the attributability constraint in a satisfying way. This constraint says that an account of agency should explain under which conditions the guidance of a process is attributable to the whole individual as opposed to her subsystems alone. Again, we find this constraint, if only implicitly, already in Frankfurt's early paper. So here's the new difficulty that we now run into. Perception-like goal-representing states occur both within subsystems and at the level of the whole individual. Here's an example. Suppose that your motor system computes a representation of an arm and a hand's goal states. Suppose that that representation is supposed to guide your reflex, that is, passive movement of pulling away your hand from a hot stove. Further, suppose that first your wrist was relaxed, and the representation now specifies the degree to which your wrist must be turned. Now, these goal-representing perception-like states in the motor system, first of all, plausibly occur only in that motor system, and second, because of that, do not plausibly constitute the individual's, that is, your guidance. What we need for this kind of account to be complete is an idea of the conditions under which a goal-representing state is a state of the individual. Now, I think that these difficulties that recent accounts of action run into motivate looking for a new account, and in the paper and in today's presentation, I want to take first steps towards such an account. That brings me to the next section of my video, guidance of visual attention. In this section, I want to give an empirical explication of individuals' guidance of visual attention, in particular of primates' guidance of visual attention. The explication I want to give says the following. It says that central executive control realizes primates' guidance of their visual attention shifts. What is central executive control? Central executive control is the control of a process by one of the individual's psychological systems, the central executive system. What is this system? The central executive system coordinates and integrates psychological states and processes from different modalities and from different psychological subsystems. The system achieves such coordination and integration by deploying its own central processing and storage resources through its characteristic ways of functioning, what is typically called the executive functions. So basically the idea is that this system is a type of interface for information from different psychological subsystems that is then used after being integrated for the coordination, organization of the individual's activities and processes. Now, in order to provide an empirical explication of the notion of individual's guidance in terms of central executive control, I first have to show that central executive control appropriately correlates with instances of individuals' guidance of visual attention. And then second, I have to show that we can actually deepen our understanding of the notion of individuals' guidance by appeals to central executive control. In the paper, I devote 2 subsections to doing that, and in what follows, I'm going to briefly summarize what's going on in those 2 sections. I start with the task of establishing the correlation of central executive control with primates' guidance of visual attention. Remember again the monkey. The question now is, in the paper, what psychological processes underlie the different ways, the active and the passive ways, in which individuals, in particular the monkey, shift visual attention? In the paper, I identify 3 important factors that contribute to shifts of visual attention. Now, the first way in which attention can be shifted is when it is captured. When attention is captured, it shifts passively. Think again of the monkey searching for a berry. If we flash a really bright light at him, then the light will capture his attention. Now, psychologists distinguish between 2 psychological systems for orienting attention, what they call the exogenous and the endogenous system. The exogenous system responds to stimuli that are physically salient. The system orients attention reflexively and rapidly. It's very difficult to voluntarily suppress this system's activity. The endogenous system's activity, on the other hand, is not restricted to any specific type of stimulus, and intentions, beliefs, expectations, and goals typically shape its activity. Now, it turns out that attention captured by physically salient stimuli can be fully explained by appeal to the exogenous system's activity alone. Since the exogenous system's activity correlates with captured attention shifts, it of course doesn't appropriately correlate with, and hence plausibly realize, individuals' guidance. So we can rule out the exogenous system's activity as a plausible candidate for what constitutes individuals' guidance at the level of psychological systems. Now, many shifts of attention, of course, result from the interaction of the endogenous and exogenous system. So in most cases of attention shifts, the situation is much more complicated. We find that both the activity of the exogenous system and a whole range of so-called endogenous factors influence how attention shifts. Now in the paper I say that when a factor influences but does not fully override or interrupt guided shifts, attention is drawn by a stimulus. That is, when a factor influences but does not capture attention shifts, it draws attention. Of course, factors that draw attention can both enhance and interfere with a guided process. Here's an example of what I have in mind. Suppose that the monkey, again, engages in a visual search for a red berry. Suppose also that just before, the monkey has been searching for a banana, and that searching for a banana has primed the monkey to shift attention to yellow objects more frequently. Now this tendency to be attracted by yellow objects more frequently need not interrupt his search for the berry. It just turns out that whenever he doesn't shift attention to a berry, he's more likely to shift attention to, well, something that's yellow. Again, in this case, we have an endogenous factor, namely the priming for yellow objects, that draws attention without overriding or interrupting the visual search that's guided by the individual. Now, if you look at the psychological literature, it turns out that exogenous factors such as the physical saliency of a stimulus can draw attention, but similarly a whole range of endogenous factors such as priming, long-term memory, information stored in working memory, and so on, can also draw attention. Again, these factors do not appropriately correlate with the individual's guidance, so they're not plausible candidates for constituting at the level of psychological systems the individual's guidance of visual attention. Psychological research suggests that central executive control appropriately correlates with exercises of individuals' guidance. As I explain in the paper, psychologists explain the difference between factors that draw attention and those that guide as due to the allocation of central resources by the central executive system to the guiding element. How exactly does that work? Think again of the case of visual search. Suppose that the monkey guides his visual search for the berry on the basis of a representation of the search goal, i.e., a representation of the berry in working memory. Now it will be in virtue of the central resources that the central executive system allocates to that representation of the berry that the computations of the attentional system that determine where attention is going to shift next are geared toward finding berry-like elements in the display or in the visual scene. And it's in this sense that the allocation of resources by the central executive system controls the shifts of attention that ensue. So at this point in the paper, I take it that I've established that central executive control plausibly correlates in the right way with exercises of individuals' guidance of visual attention. As I said just a little earlier, the next thing that I now have to do is explain how appeals to central executive control can help us explicate the notion of individual's guidance. Now I think we can appreciate that appeals to central executive control deepen our understanding of individual's guidance by appreciating that such appeals make the concept of individual's guidance sharper and more precise. And I'm going to provide two considerations in support of this claim. So first of all, reflection on the notion of individual's guidance, on our pre-theoretic notion of individual's guidance, suggests several marks that we typically associate with central instances of this notion. So one example would be that of a good mountain guide. What does it take to be a good mountain guide? Well, first of all, the good guide should set the goal for the expedition's ascent. Second, the good mountain guide has relevant organizational competencies. And third, a good mountain guide uses these competencies as needed to stably steer toward the goal of the expedition. Now, by appealing to central executive control, I claim we deepen our understanding of individual's guidance by connecting this notion with a kind that appears in psychological explanations. And again, remember the case of visual search. What is the role of the central executive system in visual search? Well, first of all, the central executive system implements the individual's goal by activating a representation in working memory. Also, I explain in the paper, second, the central executive system realizes organizational competencies for attaining the individual's goal insofar as it activates or holds available storage and processing resources. And finally, third, the central executive system inhibits tasks or stimuli that would interfere with the individual's attempt to attain some current goal. So by looking at these three functions of the central executive system during visual search, we can appreciate that they map in a fairly straightforward way on the pre-theoretic marks of individual's guidance that I identified just before. And I will explain in a little bit that by connecting the pre-theoretic marks with the psychological notions, we sharpen our grasp of those pre-theoretic marks and thereby our grasp of the notion of individual's guidance itself. Here's the second consideration in favor of the claim that appeals to central executive control deepen our understanding of the notion. Appeal to central executive control also helps illuminate conditions for attributing guidance to individuals rather than their subsystems alone. For consider, the central executive system functions to integrate and coordinate individual states and competencies for the successful execution of individual-level processes, such as, for example, problem-solving, inference, and of course attention shifts. So the central executive system makes it so that the activities in individual subsystems are integrated so as to yield activity by the whole individual. In particular, the central executive system marks a level of integration and coordination that helps unify psychological processes in the individual subsystems so as to generate the individual's activities directed at the individual's goals. The central executive system marks a level of integration that achieves individuals' goal-directed activities. Now, because central executive control marks such a level of integration and coordination, it's a plausible realizer of individuals' guidance as opposed to just being a process at the level of the individual subsystems. So here are two ways in which appealing to explanations in psychology may help us deepen our understanding of the notion of individual's guidance. On the one hand, by achieving a sharper grasp of the pre-theoretic marks of individual's guidance. On the other hand, by achieving a sharper grasp of what it takes for an event or a state to occur at the level of the individual as opposed to just her subsystems. In both cases, psychology helps explain individuals' guidance by appeal to the central executive's functioning. Now, the scientific notions characterizing the central executive system are, of course, sharper than our pre-theoretic marks of individuals' guidance, and they're certainly also sharper than our pre-theoretic idea of what it is to be an individual. So that appeal to these scientific notions and explanations of guidance, therefore, helps sharpen the latter notion, namely that of guidance. So at this point in the paper, I take myself to have established, on the one hand, the correlation of central executive control with guided attention shifts and exercises of individuals' guidance, and on the other hand, I take myself to have established that appeal to central executive control actually does deepen our understanding of the notion of individuals' guidance, and therefore I take it that at this point in the paper, I've provided an argument for thinking that we can explicate empirically the notion of individuals' guidance of visual attention by appeals to central executive control. Now I want to conclude my little presentation, just as I conclude the paper, by reflecting on what we've learned about the constitution of agency from what I've said so far. Now, first of all, there's ample evidence that the central executive system correlates with primates, as a matter of fact, mammals, acts across the board, including central instances of mental and bodily agency. So there's reason to think that central executive control partly constitutes primates' guidance. Such an account of the constitution of guidance in primates would help us address the attributability constraint. As I said earlier, the constraint requires explaining under which conditions the guidance of a process is attributable to the whole individual as opposed to merely one of her subsystems. And as you'll remember, working with the case of visual search, I explained that the individual guides his search partly through an image-like goal representation when the central executive system allocates central resources to that goal representation and thereby shapes, controls the search process. So it is the allocation of central resources to some process that plausibly marks attributability to the whole individual. So it seems as though we have a way of addressing the attributability constraint on the present picture. Also, on the present picture, we have a nice way of acknowledging insights of recent action theories, for it seems plausible that sometimes reflection, sometimes thought, and sometimes more perception-like goal representations help guide individuals' acts. We could say that these different capacities contribute to agency insofar as they're activated by central executive control. That is, insofar as the central executive system allocates resources to these different states and events. What unifies these different exercises of agency on this picture is the central executive system's allocation of resources, the central executive system's control. What distinguishes them is the different capacities and states partly through which an act is guided. Now, how about the second constraint, the comprehensiveness constraint? Well, appeal to central executive control will most likely not help us to fully meet the comprehensiveness constraint, for this constraint requires that an account of agency should explain all instances of agency. Sure, guidance in primates constitutes progress with respect to this constraint, for the proposal promises to account for guidance in a much wider range of animals than most of the proposals that have recently been made in action theory. We know that primates have a central executive system. Many animals, such as mammals and possibly birds, exhibit behavior that seems best explained by appeal to executive functions. So with respect to those animals, it seems that the present proposal can probably offer an explanation of what constitutes their agency. But for many other agents, it's at best unclear whether they have a central executive system. Think of animals such as jellyfish, worms, and ciliates. These animals may not even have psychologies, so it seems that these animals could not have the psychological competencies that characterize the central executive system. Well, I do not have a full account that I know to address this issue, but reflection on guidance in primates at least motivates a conjecture about the constitution of agency, a conjecture that would respect the comprehensiveness constraint. According to this conjecture, the control of a process by an individual's central structures partly constitutes that individual's guidance. In this proposal, central structures are structures that function to integrate and coordinate the activity of individual subsystems or other parts. But the conjecture leaves open whether such central structures are psychological structures or of some other nature. So the conjecture respects the comprehensiveness constraint in that it promises to apply to all agents across species. As I said earlier, I will have to leave the confirmation of this conjecture for future work. So here's what I conclude in the paper. In the paper, I argue that we can empirically explicate the notion individual's guidance by appeal to central executive control. I also suggest that exercises of primates' guidance constitutively involve central executive control. And I've concluded by conjecturing that control by integrating and coordinating central structures is a constitutive condition on agency across the board, across different types of agents and species. And that concludes my video presentation. Thanks a lot for listening.